December 9th, 1775. Just before sunrise, 120 British soldiers stepped out of a small fort in Virginia. They believed they were about to destroy a Patriot army. Instead, 30 minutes later, their attack was over. Dozens of British soldiers were dead or wounded. Their commander was dead, and the road to Virginia's largest city was open. The American side had suffered almost nothing. One man, wounded in the hand, one finger. That was the entire Patriot casualty list. But this wasn't just a small battle nobody remembers, because when the smoke cleared at Great Bridge, Britain had effectively lost Virginia, and the man responsible wasn't just a British general. He was the royal governor of the colony, a man who had once ruled Virginia from a palace, and would soon be forced to rule it from the deck of a warship. This is the story of Great Bridge, the 30-minute battle that changed the American Revolution. To understand why 120 British soldiers marched into that trap, you have to understand how close Virginia already was to rebellion. In 1775, Virginia was the largest and wealthiest British colony in North America. Its tobacco plantations generated enormous wealth. Its political leaders had enormous influence, and its population included roughly 200,000 enslaved people. If Britain could hold Virginia, it could still hope to hold the southern colonies. But if Virginia joined the rebellion, the crown would lose one of its most important possessions. And standing in the middle of that crisis was John Murray, the 4th Earl of Dunmore, the royal governor. Dunmore had watched the situation deteriorate for months. The Virginia House of Burgesses challenged royal authority. Colonial leaders were organizing militias, and news from Massachusetts made everything worse. Lexington, Concord, British troops firing on colonists. The political crisis was becoming a war. Then Dunmore made a decision. He would take away the colonists' gunpowder. On the night of April 20th, 1775, Royal Marines secretly entered Williamsburg. They seized barrels of gunpowder from the Colonial magazine, loaded them onto a wagon, and carried them toward the river. But the operation didn't stay secret. Someone saw them. By morning, an angry crowd had gathered. Virginia was armed. Virginia was furious. And Dunmore suddenly realized something terrifying. He was the governor of a colony, but he couldn't safely walk through his own capital. Within weeks, the situation became so dangerous that Dunmore abandoned Williamsburg. On June 8th, he escaped aboard a British warship. Think about that. The royal governor of Virginia was now governing Virginia from a ship, and he wasn't giving up. He needed soldiers. He needed allies. And most importantly, he needed a way to frighten Virginia back into submission. So Dunmore made one of the most controversial decisions of the Revolution. On November 7th, he issued a proclamation. He declared martial law. Then he offered freedom to enslaved people who escaped Patriot masters and joined the British. The message was simple. If you fight for the crown, you can be free. Hundreds responded. Men slipped away at night. They crossed rivers. They moved through swamps. They abandoned everything they knew, because Dunmore had offered them something the colonial system had denied them: freedom. Dunmore organized many of these men into the Royal Ethiopian Regiment. They fought under British officers, and their uniforms carried a shocking message: liberty to slaves. The proclamation terrified Virginia's slaveholders, and it also created a powerful military force for Dunmore. For a moment, it looked like his strategy might work. But there was a problem. The Patriots were getting stronger, and Dunmore needed a victory fast. On November 15th, his forces defeated Patriot militia at Kemp's Landing. It was a small victory. But Dunmore became convinced that the Virginia militia was weak. He believed the Patriots were poorly trained farmers, men who would run when professional British soldiers attacked. That confidence would become his greatest mistake, because now Dunmore turned his attention toward Norfolk. Norfolk was one of Virginia's most important ports, and there was a problem. There was only one major land route into it from the south: a road, a bridge, Great Bridge. The geography was almost perfect for defense. On both sides of the road was the Great Dismal Swamp, deep mud, standing water, dense vegetation. There was almost no way to move around the bridge. If you wanted to advance, you had to go straight across. Dunmore built a small fort on the Norfolk side, Fort Murray. He believed that controlling Great Bridge meant controlling the road to Norfolk. But the Patriots had arrived first. Colonel William Woodford brought the 2nd Virginia Regiment and other militia units to the southern side of the bridge, and instead of attacking the fort, he began digging earthworks. breastworks, defensive positions. By December 8th, Woodford had roughly 900 men, and more troops were on their way, including hundreds of North Carolina soldiers and artillery. Dunmore understood what that meant. If those reinforcements arrived, Fort Murray could be surrounded. His position would become impossible to hold. So Dunmore decided he couldn't wait. He had to attack, but he needed intelligence. And then, a man appeared in his camp, a supposed deserter. He claimed the Patriot force was tiny, only around 300 men. He said they were inexperienced, poorly trained, and ready to run. It was exactly what Dunmore wanted to hear. But there was one problem. Almost everything the man said was a lie. The Patriots had sent him. Woodford was feeding Dunmore false information, and Dunmore believed it. He took the bait. Before sunrise on December 9th, the British prepared to attack. Captain Charles Fordyce would lead the main column. His men were grenadiers, elite British infantry, professional soldiers. They formed into a tight column, 6 men across, dozens of men deep. Behind them came Loyalist militia and other troops. The plan was simple. Cross the bridge, advance down the narrow causeway, break through the Patriot defenses, and destroy Woodford's army. At dawn, British cannon opened fire. The Patriots heard the shots, but they didn't panic. They had been exchanging fire with the British for days. This sounded like another morning of harassment. Then one man noticed something different. His name was Billy Flora. He was a free black man from Portsmouth, a member of the local militia, and he was stationed forward of the main Patriot defenses, alone. He watched the British, and then he saw them repairing the bridge. Planks were being replaced. The meaning was obvious. The British weren't preparing for another exchange of fire. They were preparing to cross. Flora raised his musket. He fired, reloaded, fired again. Other sentries began retreating. Flora stayed. Shot after shot, he kept firing, 8 times. 8 reloads. He wasn't going to stop until the British were close enough to reach him. Eventually, he ran. British soldiers were coming after him. He reached the Patriot defenses, then stopped. He turned back, pulled up a plank from a small crossing, and denied the British another easy route forward. Then he disappeared behind the breastwork. The British were coming, and now the Patriots were ready. Lieutenant Travis commanded the men behind the main defensive line. His order was simple. Don't fire yet! Wait. The British grenadiers moved closer. The causeway narrowed. Swamp surrounded them. They couldn't spread out. They couldn't take cover. And the Patriot position ahead was completely silent. The silence gave the British confidence. They believed the rebels were frightened. They believed the intelligence. They believed they were about to win. At roughly 50 yards, Travis gave the order. Fire. The entire Patriot line exploded. Muskets, rifles, smoke. The British column was packed so tightly that every bullet had a target. Men fell. Then more fell. Captain Fordyce was hit. He went down, but he got back up. He removed his hat, raised it above his head, and urged his men forward. He kept walking, straight toward the Patriot wall. The grenadiers followed. Some reached the base of the earthworks, but there was nowhere to hide. The Patriots were firing from the front, while riflemen attacked from the side. Fordyce kept advancing until he was only a few yards from the defenses. Then he fell. He was dead. Later, the Patriots counted 14 musket balls in his body. 14, and still, he had kept moving forward. But his men couldn't follow him. The causeway had become a wall of bodies, dead soldiers, wounded soldiers. Confusion. The survivors couldn't advance. They couldn't retreat easily, and they couldn't escape into the swamp. The attack had become a trap. The British reserves tried to move forward. They were hit too. The column broke. And suddenly, the British were running back toward Fort Murray. The Patriots kept firing. The entire battle, from the first major exchange to the retreat, lasted roughly 30 minutes. 30 minutes, that was all. When the smoke finally cleared, the numbers were almost unbelievable. British casualties were somewhere around 60 to 100 killed, wounded or captured, depending on the accounting. Among the dead was Captain Fordyce. The Patriot casualties? 1. A single man wounded in the hand. 1 finger. That was it. Colonel Woodford later described the fight as a kind of miniature Bunker Hill, except the Patriots had held their position. and suffered almost no casualties. But the most important part wasn't the casualty numbers. It was what happened next. That night, the British abandoned Fort Murray. They retreated toward their ships. Dunmore's position in Virginia was collapsing, and 4 days later, Patriot forces marched into Norfolk. There was no major battle, no dramatic final charge. The city simply fell into Patriot hands. Dunmore was finished. The royal governor who had once controlled Virginia was now trapped aboard a British ship. He would never regain control of the colony. And Great Bridge had done something far bigger than destroy one British attack. It proved that Patriot forces could defeat British regulars when they chose the ground, prepared their defenses, and forced the enemy into a battlefield where numbers and discipline could not save them. It also showed the political power of Dunmore's proclamation. His offer of freedom to enslaved people had been intended to weaken the rebellion. Instead, it helped convince many white Virginians that the British threat was even more dangerous. Dunmore had tried to use fear, and fear had pushed Virginia further toward revolution. There is another tragedy buried inside this story. Some of the black soldiers who fought for the British were later captured. Their promised freedom did not always protect them. Some were returned to slavery. The words, "liberty to slaves," had been used as a weapon of war. But for the men who believed those words, the consequences could be devastating. That contradiction is part of the story, too, because Great Bridge wasn't a simple battle between good and evil. It was a chaotic war, where governments made promises, soldiers gambled with their lives, and ordinary people tried to survive inside a revolution they didn't control. And yet, one thing became clear. Britain had lost Virginia. Not after years of fighting, not after a giant siege, but after one failed attack, on one narrow bridge, in roughly 30 minutes. The battle is barely remembered today. Lexington gets the headlines. Bunker Hill gets the attention. Saratoga gets remembered as the turning point. Yorktown gets remembered as the victory. But before any of those moments could happen, Virginia had to survive. And at Great Bridge, it did. A British force marched forward believing the Patriots would run. Instead, they walked into a carefully prepared trap. One man, Billy Flora, bought precious minutes. Hundreds of Virginians held their fire until the perfect moment. And a narrow wooden bridge turned a professional army into a trapped column. 30 minutes later, the British were retreating. 4 days later, Norfolk was gone. And soon, Dunmore was gone too. The royal government in Virginia had effectively collapsed. The crown had lost its grip, and the American Revolution had gained something priceless. Time, because sometimes history isn't decided by the biggest army. Sometimes it comes down to a narrow road, a hidden defensive line, a false report, one soldier who refuses to run, and 30 minutes that change everything. December 9th, 1775, Great Bridge. The day Britain discovered that Virginia was no longer willing to obey.